Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Damon Cates, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this afternoon to this special program entitled Lessons from Fukushima, the Risks, Realities, and Futures of Nuclear Energy. As you know, the recent earthquake and tsunami in Japan have brought nuclear energy to the forefront of our sort of collective consciousness. There are debates going on around the world about the role of nuclear energy, about the opportunities and challenges associated with it, and about what the future holds. And of course, at the University of Chicago and Argonne National Laboratory, we have some of the world's leading thinkers on these important matters, and we are very pleased to have them joining us here today to discuss these very timely issues. I'd also like to pause for just a moment to also remember the over 1,500 alumni, students, faculty, parents that we have living in Japan right now. The University of Chicago, immediately after the crisis and disaster, sent notes and communication and set up support websites for all of our friends and families there to let them know that we're not only thinking about them at the time of the crisis, but that we're here to provide whatever support we could as the rebuilding continues. So we're very much involved with that. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Mark Peters, who is the Director for Programs at Argonne National Laboratory, where he leads short and long-term strategic planning for the laboratory science and technology mission. Among his many responsibilities, he oversees and directs the laboratory research program, and he works closely with all the scientists at Argonne, as well as the lab's Board of Governors and the University of Chicago. Prior to his current appointment, Mark has had a number of roles at Argonne, including as Deputy Associate Laboratory Director for Energy Sciences and Engineering, where he led the nuclear fuel cycle activities at Argonne. And then before coming to Argonne, Mark was at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he also has been a research fellow in geochemistry at Caltech. He earned his BS degree in geology from Auburn University, and I'm happy to report that he earned his PhD in geophysical sciences from the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Mark Peters.
Thank you. Thanks, David, very much. And welcome to everybody here and everybody online, hopefully listening to us. Today, per the title, we want to talk about Beyond Fukushima, the risks, realities, and future of nuclear energy in the United States. And I want to thank the Harris Energy Policy Institute, the U of C Energy Initiative, as well as the Chicago Alumni Association, of course, as well as and Argonne National Laboratory for co-sponsoring this fine event. Today, again, we want to focus on the accident that is occurring actually at Fukushima, and then talk a bit about its implications for the U.S. in terms of nuclear safety in the U.S., as well as talk about it in terms of implications for how we manage nuclear waste, and also more broadly what this means for U.S. and international energy policy and the role of nuclear energy in that. And I'll get to introducing my distinguished panelists after I make a few opening remarks, but we have a great panel here today to have this conversation and try to bring you different perspectives on the problem. It's a very fascinating, complex problem that we're going to discuss today. This is an appropriate place to have that conversation. So nuclear energy was born here at the University of Chicago, of course, across the street underneath Stagg Field. Enrico Fermi, as part of the Manhattan Project, harnessed the power of the atom here. And we at Argonne are proud, actually, that we grew out of that, and Enrico Fermi was our first lab director. So this is a perfect place to have that conversation. The university provides a wonderful setting, to get some different perspectives on what is a complex issue. After we grew out of the Manhattan Project at Argonne, we were, of course, commissioned as a national lab to develop nuclear technology for peaceful uses. So most of the reactors that are operating out there today in the US and worldwide, including the reactors that are experiencing issues at Fukushima, can trace their roots back to design and development that occurred in the early days at Argonne National Laboratory. And we have experts here today, Hussein, Khalil being one, as well as a lot of experts that are out here in the audience with you. They all have name tags on, and afterwards we'll be able to talk to them. There's posters in the back, and they have deep expertise in many aspects of nuclear technology, so they're available to have more detailed conversations with you as we go on. First, a couple contextual statements, then I'm going to introduce the panelists and ask them to also make some opening statements before we get into a facilitated discussion. It's important to remember the role of nuclear energy currently in the world energy supply mix. So in the United States, nuclear energy produces roughly 20% of the electricity that we use in the United States. In the world, it's on the order of 14%. And in Illinois specifically, it's very close to 50%. So we actually have the largest percentage in Illinois of any state in the United States in terms of production of electricity from nuclear energy. There's also some interesting parallels. In Illinois, we have 11 nuclear units operating at 6 different sites. 4 of those units actually have a design that is very similar to what is the design that's operating at Fukushima. So there will be, I think, an interesting conversation about how nuclear safety in Illinois specifically, but also more broadly in the United States, what's the implications of Fukushima for that? And I think we should explore that during our conversation. The safety record of the nuclear industry in the United States and worldwide has been strong, but there's been incidents through the course of the history of nuclear energy, and I think we all know about those. 3 Mile Island in the United States in 1979, Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union. After September 11th, we also did a lot to think about nuclear safety in the United States based on the terrorist threat and now we have Fukushima. So the nuclear industry has shown that they take these accidents seriously, but I think we're going to hear from our panelists some different perspectives on how well they've done that, and also what they need to do post-Fukushima to really, really make sure that we're operating these plants safely, and also what it means for the future of nuclear energy. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about the accident itself, just so everybody's read the papers and watched the TV. We don't yet know everything about what happened, but I want to provide at least a perspective from what I see about what took place, and that will hopefully set up the context for moving into the panel discussion. But first, I want to second what David said. Our condolences to the people of Japan, the struggles that they're going through, recovering from the earthquake and the tsunami. We can't forget that. And also the folks who are actually at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, actually working to recover from this crisis. There's some real heroic efforts going on there, and we need to remember them as well. And I already mentioned that we've got several colleagues from Argonne who will be here afterwards to talk a lot more detail about how the reactors are designed and work, how one could go about managing spent nuclear fuel and nuclear waste, et cetera, et cetera. So for a little bit of a thumbnail about what happened. So as we know, there was a very large earthquake in the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Japan on March 11th. It was very close to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station that the earthquake occurred. It was a 9.0 on the Richter scale. It actually caused the reactor to shut down. But one important point is that the control rods that control the ability of the reactor to go critical and actually produce heat that then goes to make electricity actually inserted. So the reactors, as best we can tell, shut down in an orderly way like we would expect them to. Where the trouble really so then what happens then is you have backup generators that come on. They're fueled by diesel. Those were operating to maintain recirculating water, et cetera. And then you had a tsunami within the hour. Very quickly you had a tsunami that was beyond, as best we can tell, was bigger than the reactor had been designed for. That led to, it compromised the ability to run the generators. It flooded the switch gears, it flooded the generators, and it also compromised the fuel supply. So then there was an 8-hour or a battery backup that kicked in. Though the batteries kicked in an orderly way, but then there was not the ability, the infrastructure in the country, and the response to the broader accident didn't allow for backup power to be restored through generators, and so that's when things sort of started to go downhill. They lost the ability to recirculate water. That led to draining of some of the cores. Remember, there's issues with the reactor cores as well as the spent fuel pools, and I think we'll talk more about that as we go through this. But there are 2 aspects to this accident that are important to remember, and I think actually the United States can learn a lot about what's going on with the reactor spent fuel pools as well as the cores. So we don't know what the integrity of the cores is at this point. They've reestablished power to the station, but it's been slow to reestablish recirculating cooling, so they're not able to recirculate water. So they did resort to pouring seawater into the cores and into the spent fuel pools to try to keep things cool. They've gone to a fresh water supply, but they still do not have the ability to recirculate water. So this is a real challenge. So that's what I mean by this is far from over. TEPCO, the Japanese utility that operates the plants, just released a roadmap actually late last week or over the weekend that suggests that just to get to the phase where they would consider this recovered, we're talking about 6 to 9 months, just to get to the point where they can go in and start to figure out what's really going on and start the cleanup. You've heard about challenges with contaminated water. Because they can't recirculate, they're pouring water on there, that's becoming contaminated, and it's building up, so the turbine basements in some of the units are flooded, so it's a very difficult situation for them to work in. I should also say the United States, through the DOE, through the national laboratories, through the NRC, have been working closely with the Japanese to help try to understand how best to mitigate this. But this is a very serious issue that we're dealing with here. So again, it's going to be a long term. I think the cleanup's going to take a long time. It's important to remember with 3 Mile Island, after they got into the phase where we were, quote, in recovery and they had to go in and recover the fuel in the core, et cetera, it took 5 years to go through that process. So this is going to be a very, very lengthy process. So with that, the plan for this afternoon is I'm going to spend a little bit of time introducing the panelists, and then we're going to ask the panelists to make opening remarks. And then we're going to spend some time amongst us having a facilitated discussion, hopefully up until about 5 o'clock. And then we're going to open it up to the audience here as well as online for questions. Goal being that we would finish by 5:30. Then there will be an opportunity for about 30 minutes for folks to interact with myself, the other panelists, as well as the folks, other folks from Argonne here in the back of the room. And there's posters set up in the back to talk about some of the more detailed aspects of nuclear energy and advanced nuclear energy technologies. So as we go through this, we're going to explore, right now we're prepared to explore 4 themes, but again, during the questions, we're very open to addressing the questions that you have of any nature. But again, sort of teeing up what I want to talk about, what does this issue with the Fukushima reactors, what does it mean, again, to the safety of the U.S. nuclear fleet? What can it tell us about the safety of the fleet? What does the U.S., both in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as well as the utilities, need to do to, quote, react to this event? And hopefully during that, we'll historically talk a little bit about what happened similarly after 3 Mile Island, after Chernobyl, and even after September 11th. What about the public perception of nuclear power? There's always polls going on about support for nuclear power, and for that matter, all energy technologies. There's, of course, a lot of polling going on right now about public perception of nuclear power in the US and worldwide post-Fukushima, and that will be a quickly evolving picture. What they say the day after will be very different than what they say 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks after, what they say today, what they say 6 months from now. So I'd like to talk about that as well. Again, what does it say about how we manage nuclear waste? One of the big issues is that you have the spent fuel that's come out of the core and it's sitting in wet pools at the site. And those are actually at issue right now. And that's a similar storage method to what we use in the United States. So I think it provides us an opportunity to have an interesting discussion around the policy of how we manage nuclear waste and what the US should do in response to the incident. And then finally, what does it mean for the broader policy perspective of energy policy and the role of nuclear? So with that, I'd like to take a couple minutes and introduce my 3 panelists, the 3 panelists who are up here with me, and then ask them to make some remarks, and then we'll move into the discussion. So first, let me introduce Hussein Khalil. Hussein's the director of Argonne's Nuclear Engineering Division, where he's responsible for our research portfolio on advanced nuclear reactor technologies and non-proliferation in support of DOE programs, as well as working closely with industry on advanced reactor concepts. He's been an Argonne scientist since 1983. He has a PhD from MIT and an MBA from the University of Chicago, so another alum up here with us. He's a fellow of the American Nuclear Society, and he's one of the 2 US members working on the experts group for what we call the Generation 4 International Forum. So thinking about advanced reactors, what's operating out there now are generation sort of 2 reactors. Generation 4 reactors are advanced reactors, so he's an expert in advanced reactors, as well as knowing quite a bit about light water reactors in the fleet that operates today. So Hussein, thank you for being here. Our second panelist, going over here, and then I'll come back to Kennette, is Dr. Robert Topel. He's the Isidore Brown and Gladys J. Brown Distinguished Service Professor in Urban and Labor Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and also the director of the George J. Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and the State. He's also a member of the advisory board and intimately involved in the University of Chicago Energy Initiative, who's helping co-sponsor this event. And he specializes in microeconomics and applied econometrics, and has thought a lot about the economics of nuclear power. And I'd like to bring his perspective to the table here, and particularly as we think about the broader policy implications of what we're experiencing here from the Japanese accidents. His recent awards include the 2005 Eugene Garfield Award from Research America and the 2007 Kenneth Award from the International Health Economics Association. And he has a PhD in economics from UCLA. And finally, to my right, Kennette Benedict, who since 2005 has been the executive director and publisher for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Prior to that, from 1992 to 2005, Kennette directed the International Peace and Security Program at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, where she led a $50 million initiative on science, technology, and security, and also established and directed the Foundation's initiative in the former Soviet Union from 1992 to 2002. And prior to joining the MacArthur Foundation, Kennette taught at Rutgers University and also at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she has a PhD in political science from Stanford University. So with that, let's welcome our distinguished panelists. So again, what I'd like to do is I'll start with Hussein to Kennette and then over to Bob. If you could provide some opening statements, please.
Yes, and to be efficient about this, I wrote some thoughts down in advance, which I'd like to share with you. The severe earthquake and tsunami that struck the coast of Japan on March 11 were the first natural disaster to cause grave damage to a nuclear power plant. This damage and the subsequent release of some radioactive material to the environment understandably increased concern about the safety of nuclear power plants in operation around the world. And this concern was perhaps heightened by the fact that this accident affected a reactor type, the boiling water reactor, which is widely used, and that it occurred in an advanced industrial nation. Fortunately, based on the current data and analysis, it appears that there will be no widespread health consequences. It's too early to know for sure, but there's a good possibility this will be the case. The local population was evacuated in time and does not seem to have received radiation doses liable to induce health effects. In fact, the consequences of Fukushima, of the reactor accident, at least so far, pale in comparison to the enormous death and injury toll, the human suffering, and the devastating physical and economic damage from the earthquake and the tsunami themselves. Because of differences in natural phenomena hazards, reactor design features, and accident response capabilities, it's very unlikely that a Fukushima-like event could occur at a nuclear power plant in the US. Even so, nuclear power installations in the US and around the world are re-examining their safety posture and emergency response procedures to verify their ability to respond quickly and effectively to extreme natural or human-initiated events, including events that damage safety systems of the reactors and spent fuel storage facilities. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has launched a short-term, a 90-day review to evaluate the ability of U.S. plants to protect against natural disasters, and they've also initiated a longer-term review to evaluate all technical issues associated with reactor safety, including those that may require additional research and possible changes to reactor operations and oversight. Intensive efforts have also been initiated by the industry and research organizations around the world to understand more fully the damage to the Fukushima plants and the precise role that natural events and human mitigation efforts played in the progression of the events and their environmental and health consequences. Though it's too early to draw definitive conclusions about changes in reactor design, operation, accident response, and regulation that may be motivated by Fukushima, it's not too early to consider and to discuss the risks and benefits of nuclear energy and possible implications for its future use. Nuclear fission is a major energy source today, and it has proven its value to society in the US, Japan, and elsewhere. Nuclear currently provides 20% of electricity in the US, as Mark pointed out, but 70% of electricity from non-emitting sources. In Illinois, nuclear power provides almost 50% of electricity. Nuclear fission is proven, it's affordable, and it's a non-emitting energy source, and it has a large and secure resource base, and so great potential as a component of a clean and secure energy mix for the future. The Fukushima accident and the earlier accidents at TMI and Chernobyl have also, of course, demonstrated the associated risks. And they highlight that it's imperative to continue to be vigilant about the safety of nuclear power plants in response to either natural or human-initiated threats. As the nuclear industry and the research community have demonstrated following the accidents at TMI and Chernobyl, the events and lessons from Fukushima will be used to critically examine and improve the established plant safety provisions, accident response procedures, and emergency preparedness measures. They'll also be reflected in the development and design of future systems, advanced systems that can improve upon the overall safety characteristics of the existing plants, especially through increased use of intrinsic design features and fail-safe natural phenomena to minimize possibility of reactor damage or adverse effects on health and the environment. That the damage at Fukushima may ultimately motivate re-examination of the severity of site-specific natural events that reactors should be designed to withstand, but it doesn't call into question the basic approach used to assure safety of reactor design and operation. That basic approach calls for provision of highly reliable, redundant, and independent means known as the concept of defense in depth to assure that fundamental safety requirements are met. I'm very pleased to participate in this panel discussion here at the university. As Mark mentioned, this university and Argonne brought nuclear power into being, starting with the world's first man-made self-sustaining chain reaction here in 1942 under the leadership of Enrico Fermi, who later became Argonne's first director. Argonne today continues to carry out research to advance the operation and safety of existing reactors and to develop future generation nuclear energy systems, reactors and fuel cycles that can contribute to meeting energy needs worldwide for safe, clean, and affordable energy. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hussein. Kennette.
Thank you. And thank you very much for hosting this panel discussion today. I am from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, actually a sister organization to Argonne. Some of you may not realize that, but it also was born out of the atomic age. It was started by the scientists who were involved in the first self-sustaining chain reaction right here at the University of Chicago. Many of them had gone out to Los Alamos to work on the bomb. There's a little bit of a kind of a, in your history, there was first this reaction and then Argonne and safe energy, but between those two was the bomb. And the history of the Bulletin is one of trying to tell the public about the dangers of this technology. And I want to start with that. This is the most dangerous technology on Earth. The bombs that were created during the Cold War the number was extraordinary. We still can demolish the world with bombs. And peaceful nuclear reactions are, in a sense, trying to control the bomb, almost always trying to control the bomb. One of our board members, Rob Sokolow, talks about the nuclear fission that occurs as the fire that you can't put out. It takes an enormous amount to control this very dangerous technology. And I think that's the starting point that the Bulletin scientists had, and wanted to make sure that citizens understood the dangers of the technology as well as the benefits. Whether the benefits are in bombs that can be used against an enemy across the ocean, or the benefits are those to generate electricity for economic development. The history, though, has been one of secrecy. First with the bomb, perhaps for obvious reasons. The secrets of the atomic bomb first, and then the nuclear bomb were closely held. But in a way, we moved quickly from the bomb to nuclear reactors without a great deal of transparency in between. We moved from the needs of military security to the business needs for proprietary information that should be kept essentially close in and not as available to the public as we might like it. And the Bulletin has, for 66 years now, been publishing articles about how to solve the problems of nuclear generation for peaceful purposes, as well as publishing articles about the dangers of nuclear weapons. This is a dual-use technology. In 1982, in fact, Frank von Hippel, who's on our board of sponsors, published an article in the Bulletin in 1982 about the problems of overpressurization in GE Mark I nuclear reactors. And as you read that article, you will feel as if you are listening to the broadcasts and the news about Fukushima. It was almost exactly the same problem. The release of radioactive steam and material was something that people were worried about very early on in the 70s. I think even when that, if you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but even at the very beginning, they were worried about the problems that have been displayed recently. The Europeans took this article to heart, and they actually adopted the solutions that Frank and his co-authors suggested to filter out the radiation as the steam came out. But the NRC brought this to the industry here, and the industry said, well, this is going to really cost a whole lot of money, and I don't think we really need it, so we didn't go ahead with those kinds of plans. And I bring this up only because I think it's important to understand the history, to understand the relationship of the public as represented by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the industry, and the needs for secrecy that both the military and the industry, maybe rightfully, but have invoked. I think all of this is to say that safety has not been uppermost in the minds of those who are designing and constructing nuclear power plants. You'll often hear that cost comes first, and in fact, John Rowe, who's a really quite courageous CEO of Exelon, which here in Illinois produces our nuclear energy, often talks about cost. He suggested that just the other day that with the additional safety measures that will need to be taken after Fukushima, that essentially nuclear energy will not be cost effective to develop here in the United States. And I think that that's certainly the view that private industry is meant to take and will continue to take, but less about safety, and that's something I think we need to look at. Are there designs that are safer? Are there designs that might be adopted that could be safer? The issue of the spent fuel, I think, is another one. It's one that we've kind of literally kicked down the road, or kicked into these overstocked spent fuel pools. The National Academy panel has suggested that a technology using dry casks could be used, and those are in place, but they aren't everywhere, and they aren't used everywhere. we need to ask why. We need to ask why safety measures that have already been suggested are not in place right now. Finally, I think the larger discussion, and probably one we may not want to engage in here, but I think one that all of us need to think about, is how to make decisions for our common good, for economic development, about energy and about energy development. How do we deal with climate change? As we know, it is, nuclear energy is a technology that does not emit carbon, CO2, and so it is probably part of the mix that we will need. But I think we need to understand, the public needs to understand more about what the risks are, what the calculations are, who's doing the calculation, and how we understand the benefits we may get from nuclear energy in relation to the costs. When we talk about these incidents, we talk about them as accidents. But given the complexity of the technology, the danger that we know is there, it's hard to think of them as accidents. I like to think of them more as, you think about car accidents. We're told now teenagers are taught to think about them as crashes. They're not accidents. When you've got a powerful instrument like a car and a teenager behind the wheel, you know, the probabilities can be pretty high that there will be a crash, and it's not necessarily an accident. And I think that's another way to think about these, that it's hard to imagine that there wouldn't be something that goes wrong. And in fact, there have been more incidents, I suppose, that we don't know about, or that are not as widely known as the three that are usually referred to, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and now Fukushima. So we need to understand more what this technology brings us, both the good and also the not so good. And ask ourselves, ask those who design, who construct, who make, who use this energy on our behalf, what they think is the level of safety we need to accept. And we need to question them about how it is they view our welfare, and how we can together come to some sensible conclusions about nuclear energy in a larger energy picture. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is one that has had a long history here on campus. When the March 11th disaster began, we went into full gear. You'll see on our website continuing coverage of Fukushima. And in fact, you'll see a daily report from the vice chair of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission, who's one of our colleagues, Tatsu Suzuki, who's giving you very brief updates, which you may find interesting. We also have as well some materials in the back, print materials of articles that we've published over the last 2 or 3 weeks. You're welcome to take those home, and welcome to look at our website, thebulletin.org. Thank you.
Thanks. Bob.
Well, thanks for having me. You started by referring to the number of people in the room with deep expertise in nuclear power and nuclear energy. I want to make clear that I'm not one of them. I'm an economist, and as an economist I can provide something of a framework for thinking about the costs and benefits of certain activities, of which building nuclear plants and operating nuclear plants is one. And we can think about whether those decisions to build and operate are, when they're taken by private actors or by governments, are likely to be useful decisions, or what economists would call efficient decisions. Now, in the US and Japan, the decisions about where to locate and how many to locate and how to operate nuclear plants are basically largely taken by private investors, constrained in various ways by government regulations. And so those actions are broadly taken in markets. And there, as many of you know, and as an economist do know, there are certain things that markets do well, and there are certain things that markets don't do so well. When markets operate well, they allocate resources to their highest valued use. That means they put the nuclear plants in the right place, and they put them with the right technology and operate it in the right way. So they allocate land to grow wheat, land for energy exploration, land for energy production, land for nuclear plants, and land for nuclear wastes. They allocate the risks to those individuals who are most willing to bear them. But in order for markets to work well, in order to guide people to make the right kinds of decisions, sometimes economists say that prices are the way that market participants communicate with each other. And those prices have to tell the truth, so we need the right prices. Those prices then have to contain information about values and costs, and they provide the incentives to act on that information. But when the information in prices is either inaccurate or even non-existent in some cases, markets fail. And that's a problem that economists refer to as externalities, that an action by me, party A, imposes a cost on other parties B, and A doesn't take that cost imposed on others into account. Now, it can also be a benefit. So sometimes when there's a negative externality that I just referred to, you get too much of an activity in a market economy. In other cases where there's a positive externality, where my actions impose benefits on others, you get too little of that kind of activity from market decisions. So with externalities, information in prices is inaccurate, and actions turn out to be inefficient in an economic sense, and that's the problem of market failure. And maybe Fukushima is sort of an example of that, because it seems to be, from an economist's perspective at least, and looking ex post, an example of distorted decision making. Why did they build the, just sort of not an entirely rhetorical question, maybe we'll come back to it, why did they build the reserve generation facilities and the diesel tanks on the ocean side of a plant in a country that coined the name tsunami? So were those costs of that low probability event underestimated by the decision makers? Ex post, it appears to us at least that they were. So to an economist's ear, I want to dwell on this point about externalities. To an economist's ear, almost all of the hubbub that we hear about Fukushima and more generally the future of nuclear power or the future path of energy revolves around these externalities, both positive and negative, and the incompleteness of markets. Kennette referred to safety not particularly being taken into account, and that was my point about where they put their generation facilities. Prices aren't right, relevant actors aren't making right decisions. Problems can be exacerbated because prices are wrong, and also because governments make politically motivated decisions when they have to step into the void where markets can't guide decisions efficiently. And you can think about these negative externalities. We've got an example before us, but with regard to nuclear plants, you can think about the location of them. I want that in somebody else's backyard. It's the old not in my backyard problem, because there are going to be costs associated with it. There are possible costs that can be imposed on me from its presence. What about the location of spent fuel? Well, again, it's the same problem, not in my backyard. And how do we bring those costs of those perceived costs to the decision maker's attention? But there are positive externalities as well. And some of those externalities occur in other markets, because fossil fuels generate costs, as we've now learned, that fall on people many generations out in the future. So climate change provides a negative externality in one market, but that's sort of a positive externality for the production of nuclear fuel if carbon ends up being priced, because the cost of an alternative is higher. For energy security, for the same reasons that, for related reasons, there's a negative externality in the market for fossil fuels, because we devote so many resources to protecting the sea lanes that bring us that stuff, and that's an advantage for alternative fuels like nuclear. Over time, we expect, if carbon ever does end up getting priced, that the price of carbon is going to rise, if done right, and we can go into this later, at the rate of interest over time. So carbon-based fuels are going to become much more expensive over time, which is going to provide us an advantage to other alternatives. And my understanding of the technology of nuclear is that it may not be competitive now, but it may well be at positive carbon prices and with technological advance in the future. But there are certain aspects that make the correct pricing extraordinarily difficult and open the way to government intervention. Investments in social costs in this industry are extraordinarily long-lived. Current actions stay with us, just as they do for climate change. Plants have a long payoff period, and I told you I'm not an expert, but I'm expert enough to read a number. And the payback period for a nuclear plant is something on the order of 50 years or more, which is longer than your average production facility. The life cycle of those social costs is also very long. We all know about how long we have to store, or we all know a little about how long we have to store the waste products and how you have to maintain the casks in which they're made. So the impacts of accidents are not only exist at a point in time, but they exist far off into the future, and we have to value those things in thinking about how to allocate and and whether nuclear is a worthwhile energy or alternative for us. The current investments, in other words, bear substantial risks. There's technical progress that remains uncertain. We don't know how it's going to play out. But also we have to keep in mind that the path of government action is going to be unpredictable, and decision makers have to take that into account today. So I'm going to just leave it there, and maybe we can start our conversation.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you, all three of you, very much. Very, very good. Different perspectives. That's important to get out. Yeah.
Mark, I was just wondering if I could comment on the observation that the industry, for its profit motivation, may not be emphasizing safety as strongly as it should be. If we look at 3 Mile Island as an example, that accident was first and foremost a financial disaster for the utility GPU, which owned the reactor. The release of radioactivity was very minor. The health effects were very minor. And today, of course, the same is true. All owners of these incredibly expensive facilities have a tremendous incentive to keep them operating, safely, and even in cases where they've been paid off, they're cash cows, and they're of tremendous value. So I just want to differ from the view that safety and economics run counter to each other.
Okay. Kennette, did you want to respond to our?
Well, I think it has to do perhaps with the initiation and the design features at the beginning. For instance, when even in the 50s, we knew about pebble bed reactors. In the pages of the Bulletin, you can see articles about traveling wave reactors. You can see a lot of designs that were shelved, perhaps because we needed reactors which could also produce plutonium for our nuclear weapons. I mean, that is a possibility. But I think if we look at the life extension of some of these reactors, which are now 40 years old, 50 years old, like the one at Fukushima, you have to ask yourself, well, why don't we shut those down? Because we know there are better designs out there. And are we interested enough in safety to say, let's go full bore on some new designs, which we are pretty sure are going to be a lot safer, rather than keeping around these old reactors, which, yes, are maybe cash cows, but that do present some really sticky problems. Yes, a nuclear disaster anywhere is one everywhere, and surely the nuclear industry is clear about that, and they understand it, but it's the action in the face of that knowledge that leads me to believe that there's a disconnect there.
You're sort of going where I wanted to go anyway. So we have 20% of our electricity from nuclear. There's certain realities that we face.
Right.
20% of our electricity comes from nuclear. I believe it's 23 units have the same Mark I design, if I recollect.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to think through what should the U.S. do in response to Fukushima. And I'm interested in your perspective, Kennette.
Well, what they should do. I think clearly we've already taken the right steps. We're talking about inspecting existing plants, making sure that, once again, making sure that all of the safety measures that should be in place are in place. It's not just a kind of blessing, but actually these are implemented. I believe that this would be a very good time to take a very deep breath and a very big pause. We haven't built a new plant in 25 years or so, right? Because of
32 years.
32 years, okay. We haven't, right now, as of now, we haven't brought any new plant in this country, brought any online.
So there's not a strong need to put the brakes on anything related to new reactors.
Yeah, so terrific. So let's really sit down and think about this. I'm sure you at Argonne are working on new designs all the time. You would probably prefer that some newer techniques and things go into place. I know that the Chinese, for instance, have a pebble bed reactor that they've been working on for 10 years. Our expert von Brausner tells me that the Germans perfected this. And so there are some new designs around. If we're going to build them, why don't we really take a deep breath, pause, and say, maybe we should think about transformation of the industry rather than kind of around the edges, making sure that we've still got the right things and the backups to the backups and this in-depth defense. Why not just take a major break now? We've got in a way, we have this horrible disaster which allows us to, rather than going ahead with a nuclear renaissance, as it's been called, one of our authors, Alex Glosser at Princeton, calls this, rather than a renaissance, an age of discovery. Why don't we really take that historical analogy and think about this as a time for new discovery in nuclear technology, ones that will be hopefully much safer and takes into account at the outset the safety issues.
Okay, Hussein, and then I'd like to go to Bob to ask a question.
Well, you know, I completely agree. There's a tremendous incentive to develop new reactors that have more inherent, more intrinsic safety features. And we've been doing this for some time at Argonne, at other research organizations. And a lot of these reactors, such as the pebble bed reactor and the liquid metal sodium cooled reactor, which have additional passive characteristics, they've been developed to a fairly high degree of technical maturity, but none of them have been successfully commercialized yet because it appears that they can't yet compete on an economic basis with the existing technology. And that's a research challenge for us, is to actually improve the design of these systems and try to simplify them in ways without compromising their innate safety features, but to try to bring them to commercial acceptance.
So I want to hear your perspective on this, because the economics of all of this is probably one of the most interesting aspects.
Well, it's not just it is the economics, but let's think about the costs of what we've been talking about. Kennette referred to the horrible accident, and I agree. It's sort of an extreme event or incident, we used the word earlier. But let's keep in mind that 14,000 people died in this tsunami, and nobody's died as a result of the catastrophe at the plant itself, and few have died in the past accidents, although many people die in coal mines and other things related to other sources of energy. So most of the costs that we're talking about, and I'm using them costs in an economic sense, and it's cost in the sense that I think you would use the term as well, are things that we conceive could happen with the use of this energy source, not things that have happened with this energy source. And that's not to deny that those things are really important. It's just that we haven't seen the kinds of disasters as yet from our historical record, if we act as frequentists in this, that are the same as the ones we might conceive could happen in the future.
But can you speak a little bit, you talked about this in your remarks some, but the barriers to developing new plants, bringing new technologies online, they're real. And Hussein alluded to economics. Quite frankly, from my perspective, I don't disagree with you at all that it would be nice to bring these new technologies online. But when you talk to John Rowe or somebody like that, there's no incentive from his perspective.
And there's likely to be less incentive, because now we've discovered in this country that we have a lot of natural gas that, while it doesn't have the same carbon advantages that nuclear has, it has a 25% smaller carbon footprint. I don't think we need to think about like the scale of the operations as a big impediment. Capital markets can handle that. They can get the investments that'll fund as big a plant as you want, and they can look out into the future and see what the returns are. Although there's a great deal of uncertainty about government policies and what the tax on carbon or something like that might be. Those are the kinds of impediments that I'm thinking about. But it's worth noting that we haven't built a new plant since 1977. Now that's a little bit misleading, because while you were talking about that, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. It's been longer than that since we've built a refinery in this country, but we end up producing more fuel from refineries, and the same thing is happening, as I understand it, in nuclear plants, that the share of nuclear in our total use of electricity has remained fairly constant, but we're using a lot more electricity, so we're squeezing more out of every plant. We're running them more efficiently than they did before. So it's not as if by not building plants, the nuclear share or nuclear footprint in the electricity market is declining. In fact, it's been maintained over all those years.
Okay, thanks. So I want to move off this a little bit, but I did want to make the point so everyone understands. I think Hussein touched on it in his remarks a little bit. The U.S. is doing something in response. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is doing a short-term and a long-term look at reactor safety. Utilities have been, I'll use the word proactive about getting out there and looking at their systems. I don't want to argue about whether it's enough or not, but just so the audience understands that there has been a response on the part of the United States to this, and I think it will continue to be taken seriously. But they have to weigh, as John Rowe himself said, you have to weigh the costs of staying in this business, because we yet to have the shoe drop on what they're going to have to do to their plants after they do this evaluation. There's likely that they're going to have to go in and do something to the existing plants to respond to what we saw at Fukushima after they look at the severe accident basis and all of that. And so it's important we don't know those answers yet. But I wanted to move to another near-term issue in my mind, and that's spent fuel, if we can. So as I said during my remarks, I think they have spent fuel stored in pools. They have a little bit of dry cask storage there. But if you look at the United States situation, the majority of our spent fuel is spread over multiple sites, and it's mostly in pools, just like they have there. And in the case of the 23 units, the Mark I units that are in the United States, they're the same pools that are sitting high in the reactor. We've done things post 9/11 that we can't speak to in public to harden those. However, it's not just the security on site, but what should we do? And then we've kicked the can down the road, as you say. So we walk away from a repository program, policy space. There's lots of ways to think about managing nuclear waste, either disposing in a repository, reprocessing, all kinds of different conversations we could have. But what should we do in the near term to manage the inventory that's out there right now? And they're operating, they continue to crank out spent fuel. There's 70,000 metric tons sitting there now, and it's just going to continue to grow. What should we do, and where should we be, say, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now in terms of how we manage spent fuel?
Well, I feel as though, yeah, you get to start. I mean, I feel like Steve Berry and Bob, a few people are here who will answer this much better than I, but I can certainly give a view. Well, I think as I said, the dry cask methodology seems to be fairly good. I think, and so that would be a near-term solution, most likely. I'm interested in some other countries and the way they have taken this on. I just heard a talk by someone from Arriva saying, oh, we'll take all your spent fuel in France, just give it to us. Of course, we'll charge you a small fee, but we'd love to have your spent fuel, and they'll use it to, I suppose, to reprocess it and to use it in their nuclear reactors. That's not a policy that we have favored in this country for several fairly good reasons, having to do some with nuclear security and the risk of proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Finns are about to put spent fuel in very deep depositories, I understand. The Canadians went through a 3-year-long process of talking to everybody across the country in Canada only to just to find out where they might be able to put sites, a repository. And it kind of blew up in the end, and now they still don't have a place to put it. I think the key, though, is public involvement. And I think that is a place where the government and the industry, I think, have fallen down, if I can put it that way. We know very little about, most of us, and know very little about nuclear energy and nuclear reactors. And you know, one of the positive externalities of the Fukushima accident is that many more people are interested in nuclear energy, and I think that's terrific. But it's unfortunate it takes an accident to do it. Whatever we decide, I think it needs to be something that is palatable to the public, involves the public in the decision making, so they understand both the benefits they're getting and the risks. You know, vitrification, I mean, you know the technologies. I think they're out there. I think it's a question of being somebody taking responsibility. The government is supposed to do that, but they have not developed a process that is useful. So, yeah, we're still stuck with it.
Thanks. Hussein?
Well, I think the question about what should be done with the spent fuel, I think we need to divide it into two main sort of aspects. One of them is a sort of the shorter term aspect where nuclear reactors have to manage their fuel. Sometimes they have to unload fuel and bring it back into the reactor for further irradiation. So there is a need for closely located storage of fuel that can be accessed and reinserted in the reactor as needed. And this operational need will persist. What's very much less needed and desirable is to have this large accumulating inventory of fuel that's been fully used and is no longer going to be reinserted in the reactor. The utilities basically have no place to send this fuel, and so they're forced to keep it at their sites. Initially, it's kept in the storage pools. It requires active cooling. It's still radioactive enough. It's still emitting enough heat that it requires active cooling, and the spent fuel pools provide that capability. But of course the heat emission decays, and it decays fairly rapidly, so that after a period of time the fuel can be stored in a dry location, and it's generally accepted that these very robust casks for dry storage of fuel would offer greater protection against accidents, greater protection against possible attacks, malicious attacks. And so that would be desirable to reduce the amount of fuel that's stored in these pools to provide additional dry storage capabilities. You know, Fukushima, additionally to being the first reactor accident or crash or whatever we want to call it, disaster that was caused by natural events, by a natural disaster, was the first time that multiple units and multiple storage pools were all involved at the same site, and it's a terribly complicating and undesirable situation to have the recovery actions so complicated by this. So it's very clear that at least, you know, conceptually, it's not a good idea to have all this fuel inventory in close proximity to the reactor, and to the extent that the generating companies can afford it, they need to move as much of this inventory farther away from the reactor and to provide for more robust storage.
Thank you. Anything?
Well, I mean, I want to agree with something that Khalil said, but quite apart from the technology of maybe you don't want the stuff located next to the reactor, it's hard to believe that the optimal outcome is to have spent fuel sort of uniformly distributed across the country at the locations where all the plants are, rather than having it in some other place. And the other place you want it is You think I'm going to name a certain physical place? You're wrong. You want it in the place where people are most willing to accept it, where it's the least cost in an economic sense. Now, we found out that evidently that's not Yucca Mountain, but there are two constraints there. Number one, you have to convince the people near the locale where you're going to put it that they would like to have it there, and then you have to convince the people whose neighborhood the train has to go through on the way, and everybody wants the train to go through somebody else's neighborhood to get there. And that appears, from my limited perspective on this, to have been much the constraint, that the political negotiation, it wasn't a market negotiation, it was a political negotiation over this. We couldn't give them enough to take the stuff, and maybe that will be resolved later, but maybe not. But we're stuck now with a situation where, like I said, it's kind of uniformly distributed across the country, which doesn't seem to be the optimal solution.
So thank you. I do want to move to questions, but I want to just spend a couple more minutes. But on the nuclear waste issue, since you're here, you're interested in the problem. There's a lot of things going on the national policy front that are interesting, and you'll start to see more coming out. The president formed what he called a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Energy Future. After the policy decision was made to walk away from the license application at Yucca Mountain, he formed this Blue Ribbon Commission, very distinguished group. They're going to be coming out with draft recommendations to the Secretary of Energy in July. That'll be publicly available information, and it'll be speaking to the need for centralized interim storage in all likelihood. It'll be speaking to the need about public involvement, volunteer siting, and all those important questions. And so that will lead to a policy conversation in this country about what to do about nuclear waste. It's interesting, when Fukushima happened, I thought that it would accelerate that conversation, but it happened much faster than I thought I even imagined. Within 2 weeks, I was getting questions from various decision makers about what are we going to do about the waste, and it was because of the impact on the spent fuel pools that were sitting there. So it's a disaster, but it will actually drive some very interesting policy conversations in the United States. So I did want to leave time for questions, and I'm going to ask you a question. You may choose not to answer. All three of you may choose not to answer it, because I'm going to ask you to do it in 2 or 3 sentences. What's the future of nuclear energy in the United States?
I can answer in 2 or 3 words.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay. I mean, what should be the contribution?
In the U.S., we have a lot of energy options. Not the same is true in other countries. We also have a much less public sort of government determination of energy policy. And so I think the prospects for new plants are very limited, but I think we'll try to keep our existing plants going and try to get the most out of them for as long as we can safely do it.
Okay, thanks. Kennette, last word.
Well, I'm going to do better than Bob. It depends.
I'll change my mind.
In terms of brevity, it depends.
So I don't know, it depends, and just we're looking at an existing fleet, and the prospects of new builds aren't terribly good. That's what I heard. Interesting.
Well, I mean, if other technologies turn out to be a bust, and if we really are serious about reducing our carbon footprint and carbon pricing becomes important, then there is a technology we have that can produce a lot of energy at relatively low cost compared to the alternatives, then nuclear energy will prosper.
Right, so those policy enablers, people followed last session, we were talking cap and trade, and that didn't make it through the political cycle. The president proposed a clean energy standard in the State of the Union. Nuclear was included in his list of clean energy. That was pre-Fukushima.
Yeah, and Mark,
so that's an interesting policy debate that will influence all this.
Yeah, I should mention there is one project that's going forward in the state of Georgia. It's benefiting from the loan guarantees. There was another project in Texas that looks like it may have been derailed, at least in part, by the Fukushima events. So, I mean, it's not completely hopeless, but it's not going forward with any energy right now.
Okay, thanks very much for your perspectives. So I want you to stay, you get to stay here with me. We're going to take some questions from the audience and online. So Bob Rosner's got the first question. Tom's going to have a microphone, so please take that.
So I want to ask a question about some of TEPCO's actions. And it gets to the heart of what Kennette was talking about, which is the attitude of a utility about safety. So the particular question has to do with reactors 1 and 3, which is that what they have done is to flood the primary containment vessel to basically try to cool the pressure vessel. The containment vessel was never spec'd to hold that much water. And they're in an area where seismic events are still happening, not just aftershocks, but events that, if they hadn't been the original event, would have been considered major earthquakes in their own right, that is well above 7 on the Richter scale. So the question is, what do you think their thought process is in doing that to the primary containment vessel, since once you crack that, you have a really serious problem?
Hussein, you're probably
well,
best to take
you know, clearly the first and foremost need is to make sure that the fuel is cooled as well as possible, and that the reactor vessel doesn't get breached and lose its ability to confine the fuel and limit the possible release of much greater amounts of radioactivity. I can certainly see your point that having too much water in the primary containment could lead to some serious concerns about structural integrity, especially in a seismic situation. But I'm not actually aware of any analysis that would cause me to be concerned about the actions they're taking along these lines. I don't. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to get to as many questions, so I know Steve Barry had one up front too. Okay. Okay.
A quick comment and then a question. One thing that continually runs through my mind as you go through this discussion about the dangers of nuclear power is something about human inability to really look at risk rationally. Specifically, coal and even more hydro are much more lethal globally than nuclear. We lose many, many more people per kilowatt hour generated from coal, and even more still from hydro. And we're getting reports right now that there are many dams in the United States that are in very fragile condition. We don't talk about that. But the question is regarding the financial situation. About 2005, 2006, there were two major economic analyses, one from MIT and one from George Tolley here, that came to the conclusion at that time that after the first 2 or 3 or possibly 4 reactors were built, new reactors would be built, that the economics would be favorable for the future ones without any kind of subsidy. Now, the costs of construction seem to have gone up, but I understand that at the same time, there's been a strong effort to reduce the costs of licensing. And so, where does the cost situation stand now? How big is the barrier to get us to put up new nuclear plants?
Bob, do you want to take a first crack, or?
I'll take the first crack. I mean, I'm a consumer, not a producer of this information. And it depends, in the number of documents I've looked at, it sort of depends on who produced the document. If it came from the World Nuclear Association, you would get one answer. If it came from Greenpeace, you'd get an entirely different answer. Now, as to the sort of, once the first 2 or 3 are built, then things will be cheaper. It sounds as if what you're referring to or what those studies were referring to is a sort of learning by doing, that we're going to figure something out. Now, if that were, this comes back to that old externality problem again, because that's another externality. If this were one firm who was building a plant and saying, okay, if I build this one, I'll be better at it the next time, that doesn't require any subsidy because I get the benefits of learning. But the fact that somebody builds a plant and then everybody else gets the value of that information from their experience of having built the plant, that is an externality, and that, yeah, that may require some subsidization to get the ball rolling, because markets won't handle that without some transfer payment to someone else. But as to where we stand right now, I come back to my previous answer, I don't know. But the estimates I've seen indicate that without taking into account some of the other external costs from safety and other things like that, that nuclear may be close to competitive with other sources. That may have changed a lot with the advent of fracking and the increase in supply of natural gas in the United States, but that's not going to apply in a lot of other countries.
But they have tried to, Steve, as you know, I think they've tried to make the design licensing process more efficient, yes, by combining the construction,
yeah, and if it's the same plant,
construction operating license. They've tried to do design certifications for standardized designs. There's been attempts to do a lot of those things. Those have yet to really be put into significant practice in the United States. So we don't yet know, I think, a lot of those.
Yeah, I think it is, well, it's clearly true that nth of a kind plants will cost less than first of a kind plants, and there's a benefit from learning and repeating the construction of these plants. But it's also true that the estimates for the cost of nuclear plants has gone up significantly over the past decade. 10 years ago, you heard estimates of $2,000 an installed kilowatt. Now you're hearing much closer to $5,000. It's not all explained by increases in commodity prices. That's a part of it. I believe part of it may be related to uncertainties in the supply chain, to uncertainties, still some remaining uncertainties in the regulatory process, and people basically, when they have to put together an accurate bid, they're reflecting contingencies and uncertainties in these estimates, and I believe that's a big part of it.
It's not just, there's a market answer to your question though too, Steve. Absent that impediment from learning by doing, where nobody wants to take the first step because it benefits everybody else, right? Absent that, the fact that private investors aren't putting up their money tells you that right now, and based on their expectations of the near future, it's not all that competitive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bob. That's good. There was one over here. Okay.
I wanted to make a few comments. One, I don't know why we're comparing nuclear just to coal or gasoline. How about renewables? That's a word that hasn't been mentioned here. If we could spend those billions of dollars that the government's talking about putting into nuclear into renewables, what could we accomplish? Secondly, you know, I noticed that talked about people being involved here. In Germany, 200,000 people walked out because they had felt the effects of Chernobyl over there. Here we haven't felt it, so. Finally, you know, I want to say that, you know, we seem to have an insatiable need for energy here, but let's talk about maybe Americans are trying to consume too much energy, and we should try to ramp down some of that. Oh, and I also wanted to say about older power plants that a lot of them are located in areas where there are tornadoes, hurricanes, and in addition, near urban centers. And how would you evacuate people from those places? Those are my comments.
So thank you for your comments. I might comment. I'd like to comment on the renewables and also the efficiency piece. There's huge opportunities to bring more renewables on into the U.S. energy supply, and I totally agree. And I think this administration is putting more resources into it than perhaps others had, and they're to be commended for that. We can argue about whether it's enough, but they are doing more. Bringing significant renewables onto the existing grid is a challenge, and we have to figure out how to store the energy. And we're doing a lot of research at Argonne to think about all these problems. And so don't take this as Argonne's all about nuclear. Argonne's about a lot of things. But there's a lot of challenges to getting to where renewables can have a significant contribution to the energy supply.
I just want to say one more thing about that, and that is that, I just saw a film about called Carbonation, Carbon. And the idea that during World War II, we were able to ramp up fairly fast, and now apparently other countries are making more, doing more of the production in renewables, and we should catch up.
Oh yeah, well, just another anecdote for you. In the case of let's take batteries. If you want to go to electrify the transportation sector, for example, the Asians are ramping up the capability to produce batteries at a scary rate, actually. And we're following that very closely because we're developing advanced technologies, but there's no U.S. industry to really take hold of what we're developing. So you're headed down the right path.
Yeah, I want to just.
Yeah, I'm just. No, but I'm just making the point that other countries are ramping up to do things that I would call clean energy technology development and manufacturing.
Yeah, just very quickly, I agree there's a tremendous incentive to develop renewables, but I'm wondering why you have the impression that it's not receiving as much attention. I look at the nuclear energy research budget very closely, and I believe it's much smaller than the budget that's going into energy efficiency and renewable forms of energy, at least in recent years in this administration. And I believe the administration is also, there's a lot of acceptance for promoting projects that can bring renewable energies closer to commercial use.
Renewables get $36 billion in loan guarantees.
Well, David, they haven't gotten $36 billion. That was just in the request. It hasn't been appropriated. They have $18 billion in nuclear, but there's plenty of loan guarantees going into renewables as well, as you know.
18 billion?
I don't remember the exact number, but it's billions. Question over here.
It's about safety. So TEPCO outsources some of the plant operations to subcontractors. So the people working at this plant right now, they are heroes, but they are relatively inexperienced, young workforce. And I think there is a structural problem in the industry because Japan has very strict dose limit. So if you exceed it, you have to retire. And so it's very difficult to train skilled labor that stays for a long time in the industry. I wonder what sort of things are done here in the U.S. to ensure that the proper skills levels of the workers at the plant to maintain high level of plant operation, and if something happens, that they can make sure that enough skilled labor is available.
Well, you have the expert on this sitting right in front of you, so I'll ask Bob Rosler to join in. But that is a problem, that we don't seem to have enough people with the skill to continue to be interested in operating and being part of the nuclear industry. There is one peculiarity, and I heard this, I don't know whether this is true, but in fact, we use a number of robotics in our plants here in the United States to limit the exposure of workers to radioactive doses that would be, beyond what would be acceptable. And I understand that there are very few in fact, none, I think, in the Fukushima plant, which is very odd since we think of Japanese manufacturing as a place where robotics, at least in car making, was almost invented. And the robots that you've seen on television now measuring some of the radioactive doses are actually from the United States. So yeah, it seemed that in this particular instance, there are some, I guess, unexplained parts of this puzzle at Fukushima that will hopefully come out and that we'll learn more about. But as to your broader question, yeah, I think that's a problem in part, again, because nuclear energy in this country hasn't really been seen as an area of growth. It's not Facebook, it's not Google, it's not something that's kind of neat technology. It's an old technology. So I think people have been less interested in engaging in it.
Enrollment at MIT in nuclear engineering has gone up.
Yeah, I believe that situation is improving a bit as you know, we're beginning to look ahead to developing future systems, and nuclear is recognized as a non-emitting energy source, and I think there's increasing recognition of a role for it in the future. And so we have begun to see a turnaround in the enrollment of students and graduation rates and so on. I want to maybe dispute, though, at least in relation to safety critical functions at the nuclear power plants, that we have a problem there. One of the main outcomes of the TMI accident was a much greater emphasis on training of operators and training of personnel that had critical safety-related functions. I don't dispute that it's a challenge to bring in qualified workers, and I certainly hope that the industry is doing well enough along these lines. I'm similarly concerned about the ability of the workers at Fukushima to cope, you know, day after day with these radiation doses, and they increased the dose limit for emergency purposes. I think to something very high. It's more than 10 rem per, yeah, 20 rem per year. So you know, it is a major challenge. No question. No question about it.
Okay, well, plenty of questions here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to just observe a very important aspect of the health issues. As most people know, it takes years, if not decades, for health problems to emerge from radiation, at which point it becomes even more notoriously difficult to establish cause and effect. So I don't want those of us gathered here today to go away with an unduly sanguine notion of health problems from these disasters. But I wanted to ask a labor question from a slightly different point of view. An industrial psychologist who's been part-time taking care of seeing workers at Fukushima since 1991, in the past several days, or at least it was just reported about 3 days ago, went in to visit the workers for the first time and warned that they are on the brink of death from overwork, which is another term, karoshi, that Japan gave to the world. As probably some of you have read, initially they were only given 1 meal a day, no opportunity to sleep in peace, and now they're also suffering from stigmatization of working for this plant, so that when they visit their families in evacuation centers, they have the finger pointed at them. This is another kind of externality I won't go into, about huge problem of stigmatization of that community in terms of its products and its people. But in any case, as has been pointed out, the Japanese government, I believe, is going to raise the allowable exposure limit again. And it's tried to throw more money at subcontracting firms, and at some point, these complacent or subcontractors are in a very weak position, so they normally send their workers in, and workers in the weakest position, i.e. who have no economic choices, are the ones who do the most dangerous work. But there seems to be a limit about throwing money and demand for loyalty that's happened. In the case of Chernobyl, I know it's hard to come at the figures, but apparently I've read figures such as 700,000 liquidators being engaged. Ostensibly, in a democracy, you can't force people to go work in a crisis like that. What do you think this means? I mean, if accidents crashes can't be ruled out, how do you ensure that you're going to have people working in the most dangerous positions that demand self-sacrifice to take care of the needs? And robots, supposing robots are introduced, I read in Fukushima in the
Excuse me, could you ask, if you can ask a question?
That's the question,
yes.
Is what to do about labor. But robots, I just wanted to add that apparently the humidity level was so high they couldn't bring back pictures at some point. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, as you referred to a democracy, we would have to pay people more to do that. And in a more autocratic regime, they would encourage people in other ways, I suppose, and that's been the history of recruiting labor supply in those places. But in a place like Japan or the United States, there are a lot of risky jobs from ranging from going into nuclear plants to being a deep sea diver and the like, and those people would have to be paid more to take the risk.
Okay, we're actually nearly out of time, and I didn't get to any online questions, so I'm sorry, but we're going to have to. I wanted to ask one last question that came in from the web, and I think it's probably a good question to pose to all three of you. And again, brief as possible, and then we can move to back to the posters. Given the time it takes to build new nuclear reactors, how can nuclear assist in the urgent issue of climate change?
Well, I think that depending on your estimates of the disruption caused by climate change, how soon they're going to be, we'll see many, many more of them. I think it's probably not at all clear that new nuclear builds will contribute much for at least a decade or two to lowering carbon emissions sufficiently to have any effect on growing climate change. So, you know, other things like efficiency, much quicker, and using as many renewables as possible are good. But yeah, it's not at all clear in the short run that it would have much effect.
Any comments?
I just wanted to add, China, a very rapidly growing economy, had a very ambitious plan for expanding nuclear generation. There are actually 28 plants under construction or about to be under construction. It's true that China is slowing down just a little bit to examine what's being learned from Fukushima, but for at least two of the major developing economies, China and India, who are stand to contribute substantially to emission of greenhouse gases, they are adopting nuclear as part of their energy solution.
Bob, any final comments?
No.
Okay, so with that, I apologize we didn't get to all your questions. Again, I think the panelists will be able to stay around. We have folks who can answer a lot of detailed questions about nuclear technologies. I want to thank everybody for being here, for your attention, for all the questions. I think, needless to say, this is a fascinating topic. There's a lot to be learned about what happened at Fukushima and its implications for how we think about nuclear in the United States and how we think about the broader policy implications of what we do about nuclear and energy in the United States, for that matter. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.